Hello and welcome to MIP TV. And with me is the veritable Bob Cooke, who's going to be reviewing another book, which is book 45. And if you're paying attention, and by golly gosh, should be out there in YouTube land, you'll notice that the one before 44 was a Yalom book. And we're going to discuss another Yalom book and one of his later ones, aren't we, Bob?
Yeah, this was a wonderful book. And he, as I said in an earlier review, in my opinion, is one of the best-known existential psychotherapists of our time. And he wrote a book about one of the core existential themes, which is basically around the concept of death anxiety. And it's called Staring into the Sun.
Yeah, something, just as a bit of a disclaimer there, don't do that. It can be very dangerous. It's not an advert. It's not an instruction. It's not an instruction manual. But yes,
very good, Rory. I really like that.
It is a book about staring fate, or kind of oblivion. That's the narrative of it, isn't it? It's about looking at oblivion. And a very existential position about, because of course, for those who are existentialists, they kind of reject any form of afterlife. It is the end of corporeal existence. So, yeah, what struck you about this book, Bob?
Well, I read this book just when I was in hospital, actually, when I was having a rotary cuff operation. And I don't know how often you've been in hospital. I've been not that many times, but, whenever I do, I think about such real core issues as my own mortality. And I was reading this book just as I came out, and I read the introduction, and he was talking about that he had prostate cancer. And that was one of the major sort of motivations, I think, to talk about death anxiety. And that's really what struck me. And of course, in this book he talks about Freud's ideas of death anxiety, which were very prevalent even over a century ago, and the idea that we all of us carry from birth to leaving this planet a low-grade death anxiety. And that often comes out in terms of stress. Times when our mortality is questioned, it comes to the forefront. And I think it's a wonderful concept to think about, because it explains some of the real anxieties that clients come with us. Yeah.
It does. Certainly things like illness or things that happen on the way in the journey of life, lost, death of friends, maybe death of a loved one. They all kind of stir that existential pot up within us, don't they?
They do. And what I also like about this book is that he gives a whole template for therapists in terms of how to work with clients who come, with this death anxiety, or as you say, it gets played out in many of these pivotal crisis points in our life. But he has a whole, tips, but the actual ways of working, and an actual schema, if you like, of how to work with people, and how to help people desensitize themselves in the times of anxious moments and crises in their life. So there's not that many books, Rory, that talks about these fundamental issues, I think.
No, I think you're right. I can only think of maybe one other, From Escape from Freedom, Erich Fromm, which is kind of a very existential book. But you're right. It's there's very few books, and it struck me that listening to what you're saying, it really does link into other theories like Erickson's 8 Stages of Man, the integrity versus despair, where people are taking stock of their lives at the end of it and are trying to work out have they lived a good life. So, yeah, a good book for what sort of student?
Well, I think therapists will deal with, just like you've said, by the way,
Mm,
people come with many anxiety issues to do with bereavement issues,
mm,
life issues, loss issues,
mm,
mortality issues.
mm.
And if the therapist can think that underneath these triggers could be a real fear of their own mortality and loss, and to bear that in mind when they're working with the clients.
Yes. Yeah. It's the undertow, isn't it, Bob?
Mm.
That's what it is. It's the
Yeah.
undertow
Mm.
of, existential anxiety is that kind of
Mm.
always with us knowledge of our own finality.
That's right. And children, of course, especially around the ages of 6, 7, 8, 9, when they're very curious about life and life skills, they will talk about the concept of death. And I
Yes.
remember talking to my own daughter about what death meant. And I think these very existential core issues are with us throughout life, and which gets triggered by, very correctly said, Rory, these these lost times.
Mm,
Um, and if and also, for example, I was thinking of a client I had the other day, and many other clients actually, who get very stressed when they haven't got things that, like money, for example.
mm, mm,
And if
mm,
you ask them, what's the symbolism of money to you? They'll
mm,
say security. And if you go further down, they'll get to loss.
mm.
And
Yeah, and it's one of those things about the human condition that's been known for a long time is that loss is very powerful. There's been a very famous experiment, wasn't there, where someone talked to people who'd lost maybe £10 or $10, and they gave them 20, and all they were $10 or £10 up, they still felt the loss of the losing £10. It seems to be a fundamental human condition that we fear loss.
yeah, and I would lose count how many times I've repeated this phrase. And it's an old Sufi phrase.
All right.
Sufi are wise mentors throughout life. And the phrase or statement is something like this: no one really dies until the last person who knows that person dies.
Mm. Mm. Well, I
That's a
think on that existential bombshell, Bob.
bombshell. But I really like that. And
Yeah.
it's actually very soothing very, very soothing for people. And it's a very enlightening phrase, I think.
Yeah, and I make light of it, but it does bring a new meaning to the word exist, doesn't it? Because
Yeah,
even if you're not there,
yeah,
you're still in people's conversations, which
that's right.
which is which is a form of existence. You're existing still in people's memories.
Yeah, and Milton Erickson, who was the most wonderful uh, hypnotherapist, wrote a
Mm,
book called "Take My Words with You," and it's in the same light of what you're just talking about. That therapists, whether they know it or not, or whether they reflect on this or not, hopefully provide such a soothing, constant object for the client.
yeah, yeah, and maybe that's another discussion we can have about object consistency and the self-psychology movement. But book review 45, we're cracking on at a pace now, Bob. Staring at the Sun, Irvin Yalom, an information book, as I say, not an instruction book,
No,
and a firm favorite author for anybody really in the world of counselling and
well
psychotherapy.
spoken.
Yeah, as always, Bob doesn't get any kind of fee from the publishers or the authors for this. He does it for the love of it. And we'll put a link down below there, so that you click on it, you can inspect the book and buy it if you want. And as always, Bob Cooke, thank you very much.
Thank you.